2 weeks ago on Easter, we started a new series entitled The Resurrection. But the focus of this series is on all the people that Jesus revealed himself to after he rose from the dead. You see, Jesus didn't just appear to a handful of people one or two times after he was resurrected. No. Jesus appeared to hundreds of people during the 40 days he was here on this earth after his resurrection. And people, these weren't just sightings. It wasn't like someone saw Bigfoot down around Cookson. How many know what I'm talking about? No, these weren't sightings. These were people who saw Jesus and who talked with Jesus and who touched Jesus with their hands to verify that he was flesh and bone and not just a spirit. In fact, the resurrection of Jesus was confirmed by so many reliable witnesses that even Josephus wrote about it 50 to 60 years later. So what we're doing in this series is we're looking at each incident in which Jesus appeared to people after his resurrection. And we started with Mary Magdalene because she's the first person to see Jesus after he rose from the dead. But if you remember, something weird happened in her encounter with Jesus. Something very unusual, and I want to look at that before we move on in this series. So turn with me, if you would, to the book of John, chapter 20. We're going to read verses 17 and 18. Jesus said unto her, Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascended to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord. Now this is after the resurrection. And that he had spoken these things unto her. Do you see that? Jesus said, Don't touch me. Now that's kind of weird because Jesus allowed everyone else to touch him after he rose from the dead, but not Mary Magdalene. Why? It makes you wonder why Jesus wouldn't allow her to touch him, but he would allow everyone else to touch him. But that's not the only weird thing that happened on that day. In fact, at the very same time that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene, Jerusalem experienced what we might call a zombie apocalypse. Now, it wasn't a real zombie apocalypse. I'm not into zombies. How many of you like The Walking Dead? You know, my nieces and nephew, they love The Walking Dead, and they're always talking about it. I've never seen the show, don't really care about it. But this wasn't a zombie apocalypse. I guess that's considered to be a zombie as the living dead. Well, these weren't the living dead. These were the living. But I want you to understand, this was, in a sense, an appearance like never before. And these people were freaked out. Turn to Matthew chapter 27, verses number 51 through 53, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Notice what it says. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rock split, certain tombs broke open, and the bodies of many saints who had died were raised to life. They came out of their tombs after Jesus' resurrection, and they went into the holy city. What is the holy city? Jerusalem. And they appeared to many people. Now, people, I don't know about you, but that's weird. In fact, I can't imagine anything weirder than that. So what in the world was going on? First of all, Jesus wouldn't let Mary Magdalene touch him. The veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The stones on certain tombs rolled open. And after Jesus' resurrection, the saints in those tombs rose from the dead. And not only that, they went into Jerusalem and they appeared to many of their friends and their family. And then poof, they were gone and never mentioned again. Now, how do I know that they actually appeared to their friends and their family? Because if they didn't just appear to their friends and the family, no one would have known that they were resurrected. But they had to have known them. And so when they walked into Jerusalem and all of a sudden you see Uncle Tom, who you just buried, or Aunt Lucille, who was buried maybe 2 weeks ago, and now she's at your house, wouldn't you think maybe this was a zombie apocalypse? And then all of a sudden, poof, they had this extra dimensional body. So when it's time for them to leave, they're gone instantaneously. What in the world happened? Now, here's what's interesting. Only Matthew records this happening. And do you want to know why? It's because his book was written specifically to the Jews. If you remember, Mark's gospel was written to the Romans. Luke's gospel was to a more broader Gentile audience. And then John's gospel was written to the world. In other words, it was for everyone. But Matthew's gospel was specifically written to the Jews, and only a Jew would have understood the significance of what happened that morning and what it signified. In other words, the reason that Matthew is the only gospel that wrote about these things is because only a Jew would have understood what happened that morning and why it happened. If you weren't a Jew, you wouldn't have had a clue as to why those things happened. That's why when we read it, it doesn't really make sense. I can't tell you the number of times as a child we would get to this point when we were going through Sunday school, and the Sunday school teacher would say, I have no idea what happened. And boy, it was just so interesting. But the reason we didn't understand is because we're Gentiles. All we know is that when Jesus was resurrected that morning, some really weird things happened, and it's kind of freaky. So, what did the Jews know that we don't? Well, it all goes back to the Jewish feast. So if you don't mind, let me explain a few things about the Jewish feast. But first, let me warn you that we're not going to go in depth. We don't have time to go in depth. So I'm just going to be explaining the bare basics so you'll understand what happened that morning, why Mary Magdalene was not allowed to touch him, why these stones rolled open on the tombs, why these people came out right after Jesus Christ was resurrected, why they went into Jerusalem, and then poof, they were gone. I'm going to show you why that happened. So let's learn a little bit about the Feast of the Lord, and let's take a little informal poll if you don't mind. If you've heard of the Feast of the Lord and you know a little bit about them, I want you to raise your hand right now. I see one or two. If you've never heard of the Feast of the Lord, or you've heard of them, but you really don't know anything about them, I want you to raise your hand. All right, that's the majority of you. That's kind of what I thought. That tells me that I've got to keep it very, very simple. So let's start with the basics, and if you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. There were 7 feasts of the Lord that every Jewish male was required to keep. The Feast of Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. The first 3 feasts were celebrated in the spring, so naturally, guess what they called them? The Spring Feast. And they were also celebrated together. So the Jews normally referred to all 3 of them as Passover. So when you're reading through the Bible and it talks about them in the Old Testament going to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, they're actually talking about the first 3 feasts. The Feast of Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruits. Sometimes they refer to all 3 of those feasts as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But I want you to understand, even though they will call it by one thing, they were actually 3 distinct feasts. Passover was celebrated on Nisan the 14th. The Feast of Unleavened Bread began the next day on the 15th, and it lasted for 7 days. The Feast of First Fruits was celebrated on the morrow after the Sabbath during that week. We don't talk like that anymore, right? So in other words, on the Sunday after the 15th of Nisan. The Feast of Pentecost was celebrated 50 days from the Feast of First Fruits. You counted 7 Sabbaths, which was 49 days, and on the next day, the 50th day, you celebrated Pentecost. So it was always celebrated on a Sunday, just like the Feast of First Fruit. Now, the last 3 feasts were celebrated in the fall. So as you might have guessed, they referred to them as what? The Fall Feast. And they were also celebrated together. The Feast of Trumpets was celebrated on the 1st of Tishri. The Feast of Atonement was celebrated on the 10th of Tishri. Those are Hebrew months, if you want to know. And the Feast of Tabernacles was celebrated on the 15th of Tishri. And it lasted for 7 days. So you had 3 spring feasts that were celebrated together. Then you had the Feast of Pentecost, 50 days after that. And then the 3 fall feasts that were celebrated together. So 3 times a year, all Jewish males living in Israel were required to go to Jerusalem in order to keep these 3 feasts. Now, there's 7 feasts in all, but they refer to them as 3 feasts. The spring feast, Pentecost, and the fall feast. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16, and you'll see what I'm talking about. 3 times in a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses. And what was that place? If you come on Wednesday night, you know. Jerusalem. So 3 times in a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in Jerusalem at the Feast of Passover. That's referring to all 3 spring feasts. And at the Feast of Pentecost. And at the Feast of Tabernacles, which is referring to all 3 of the fall feasts. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. So, in the month of Nisan, you went to Jerusalem to celebrate the spring feast. 50 days later, you went to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. And in the month of Tishri, you went to celebrate the fall feast. And you were required to do that if you lived in Israel every year. Every year. No exceptions. Now, if you lived outside of the nation of Israel, you still were required to keep the feast. You just didn't have to go to Jerusalem. But if you lived inside of Israel, you were required to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year to celebrate these feasts. Now, the feast had 2 purposes. And if you're taking notes, write this down. The first purpose was to commemorate certain events in Israel's history. Every nation tends to do that. We do that. How many of you celebrate the 4th of July? Anyone celebrate the 4th of July? Yeah, you shoot off fireworks or you go to a fireworks display. And if you're a pagan, you drink beer, right? What does that make you? I'm just sorry, just kidding. Anyways, why do we celebrate the 4th of July? We celebrate the 4th of July because we're commemorating the Declaration of Independence. That's why we do that. Yeah. Now, the first purpose of the feast was to commemorate certain events in Israel's history or Israel's past. The Feast of Passover commemorated the slaying of the Passover lamb in Egypt. Look at Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 through 24. You probably studied this when you grew up going to Sunday school. Here it is. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said unto them, Go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families, and slay the Passover lamb, and you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that is in the basin to the lintel and to the 2 doorposts. And none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the doorpost, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your house to smite you. That's why it's called Passover. The angel of death will pass over your house when they see the blood. Then he goes further. And you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children for how long? Forever. How many of you know when Jesus Christ comes back, we will not be celebrating Easter during the millennium? What will we be celebrating? The Feast of Passover. Why? Because Jesus is the Passover. He's also first fruits. That's why he was resurrected. So we will be celebrating the Jewish feast. Why don't we do that today? Because we would be weird if we did that. You wouldn't understand it. So we call it Easter. But what we're really celebrating is Jesus is our Passover lamb. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The Feast of Unleavened Bread commemorated the Exodus from Egypt. When they left in such a hurry that they didn't have time to leaven the dough for their bread. Look at Exodus chapter 12, verses 33 through 34. And the Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls bound up in the clothes on their shoulders. So remember, when they slew the Passover lamb, they applied the blood. They were supposed to do that with the shoes on their feet and the staff in their hand because God knew what was going to happen. When the angel of death passed over and all of the firstborn in Egypt died, they wanted Israel out. They were scared to death that they were all going to die. So they came to them and said, You got to leave, and you got to leave now. And that's what they did. They left. Exodus chapter 12, verses 33 through 34. The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls bound up in the clothes on their shoulders. Now, the Feast of First Fruits commemorated the crossing of the Red Sea. If you remember, once they sent them out, the Egyptians had a change of heart. So they chased after the Israelites, and they trapped them between the Red Sea and their army. And you all know the story. God divided the sea, and the Israelites walked to the other side on dry land. When the Egyptians followed them, God released the water, and they all drowned. But the Jews passed safely across to the other side. So they literally passed from death to life. You see, they all thought they were going to die. Behind them was the Egyptians' army. In front of them was the Red Sea. There's no place to go. We're all going to die. But God performed this miracle. He divided the Red Sea. There was this wall of water on each side. This wind came in and it dried out the riverbed. And they walked on dry land. And there was this fire behind them that didn't allow the Egyptians to come after them until they were on the other side. And then it went up. So the Egyptians, they came into the Red Sea. And of course, God had the waters come back, and they all drowned. Yeah. Now, the Israelites, when they were on the other side, they were considered to be the first fruits of God's chosen people. And that's what the Feast of First Fruits commemorates. They crossed the Red Sea, and they passed from death to life, and they became the first fruits of God's chosen people. The first fruits of what's going to be a huge nation much later. Now, after they crossed the Red Sea, it took them 47 days to get to Mount Sinai. And then Moses told them to consecrate themselves for 3 days because God was going to come down and reveal himself on Mount Sinai. So on the 50th day, Pentecost, the Lord appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai, and he gave him the 10 Commandments. And on that day, Israel officially became a nation. Now, they were God's people before then, but that's when they officially became a nation. And that's what the Feast of Pentecost commemorated. God giving the Israelites the law. Yeah. So what's Pentecost? It's commemoration of God giving the law, the 10 Commandments. Now, I'm not going to go into the fall feast because we don't have time to do that. Sometime in the future, I'm going to do a series on the Feast of the Lord because every Christian should know the Feast of the Lord. And I'll cover all of the feasts when I do that series. So that's the first purpose of the feast. All right? It's to commemorate certain events in Israel's history. The second purpose of the Feast of the Lord was to provide a prophetic picture of what the Messiah would do. Let me say that again. So if you're taking notes, you'll write this down. The second purpose of the Feast of the Lord was to provide a prophetic picture of what the Messiah would do. In fact, Leviticus chapter 23, verse number 2 tells us that the Feast of the Lord were meant to be rehearsals. Notice what it says. This is Leviticus 23:2. Speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them concerning the feast of the Lord, these 7 feasts you see on the back wall, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations. Now, I want you to underline that word convocations. Convocations is translated from the Hebrew word mikra, and it literally means rehearsals. So what Leviticus 23:2 is saying is that the Feast of the Lord were meant to be holy rehearsals. Now, does everyone know what a rehearsal is? I'm sure you do. A rehearsal is when you practice something in preparation for a future event. Some of you have children in dance. How many of you have children in dance? What do? Well, when they have a recital, they schedule rehearsals. In other words, they practice what they're going to be doing at the recital. Now, according to Leviticus chapter 23, verse number 2, the feasts of the Lord are rehearsals. So when the Jews kept the feast, they were actually rehearsing what the Messiah would do when he came. Yeah. So the first purpose of the Feast of the Lord is to commemorate things in the past, but the second purpose is to be a rehearsal to practice what the Messiah is going to do when he comes. In other words, everything they did during the feast was exactly what the Messiah would do when he came. Now, the spring feast has to do with the first coming of the Messiah, and the fall feast has to do with the second coming of the Messiah. In fact, look at the back wall. Let me stand up just for a second. Look at this back wall. In Jesus' first coming, he was the Passover lamb. We'll go a little bit into that, and you'll see that he fulfilled it to the most minute detail. Now, here's what's interesting and what most people don't understand. You would slay the Passover lamb on Nisan the 14th, but you would begin to roast it. And when you roast it, you didn't actually eat of it until the evening after the sun went down. Now, we reckon days from midnight to midnight, but the Jews didn't do that. When the sun went down, it started another day. So you actually partook of the Passover meal during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Why? Because leaven represents sin. And what the Passover lamb does is he takes away the sin. Remember when John the Baptist saw Jesus, what did he say? Behold, the Lamb that taketh away the sins of the world. So when you were taking or participating in the Feast of the Passover lamb and you were eating of that lamb, you also ate with unleavened bread. Why? Because the Passover lamb takes away the sins of the world. And how long did you eat unleavened bread? 7 days. Why? 7 is a number of significance. It means perfect and complete. So he took away perfectly and completely our sin. So Jesus comes, he's our Passover lamb. He also takes away the leaven. We eat that for 7 days. On Sunday, first fruits, Jesus was resurrected. And he's the first fruits of the resurrection. We'll find out he did a little bit more on that. Then we get to the Feast of Pentecost. What happened on the Feast of Pentecost? That's when God gave the law. After Jesus was resurrected, 50 days later, what was the fulfillment of Pentecost? God gave the Spirit. The commandments bring forth, and the law brings forth death. What does the Spirit bring forth? Life. So on Pentecost, we see the fulfillment. Anyone know what's going to happen on trumpets, the Feast of Trumpets? The rapture. Yeah. The rapture is going to take place. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we go to the feast. What's going to happen on the great day of atonement? Jesus physically returns to the earth. What's the Feast of Tabernacles? The Feast of Tabernacles is when Jesus Christ is going to set up his kingdom here on the earth and reign for 1,000 years. We're going to tabernacle with the Lord. Isn't that good? Now, since the Messiah has already come the first time, we can see how he fulfilled the spring feast. So let me walk you through the first three feasts and how Jesus fulfilled them down to the most minute detail. But we're not going to look at all the details because I don't have time. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what I consider to be the high points and the major things that Jesus did to fulfill the spring feast. First of all, how many of you remember Jesus' triumphant entry? Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem occurred on the 10th of Nisan, which was a very, very important day to the Jewish people. Turn back to Exodus chapter 12, verses 2 through 6, and I'll show you why. Notice what it says. This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, 10th day, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for the whole lamb, they must share one of with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them. So this is talking about the Passover lambs. So on the 10th of Nisan, every household was supposed to select a Passover lamb. And every day, for 4 days, you were supposed to inspect it to ensure that your Passover lamb had no flaws, to ensure that it was perfect. Now, when Jesus entered into Jerusalem on a donkey, all of the people began singing, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest," which is a messianic psalm. It's Psalm 118:26. You see, every Jew at the time of Jesus knew that these feasts were rehearsals, and they expected the Messiah to come to fulfill the feast. So on the 10th, everyone would pick their Passover lamb, and the high priest, he would pick his. His lamb represented the lamb for the entire nation. His was referred to, as we'll find out, the final Passover lamb. So when he brought his lamb in, the people would begin to shout, "Yes, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." But what they were doing was rehearsing for when the Messiah would really come. Well, on the 10th of Nisan, Jesus does this triumphal entry, which is the very same day the high priest is bringing in the Passover lamb. And everyone begins to shout. And many of the people recognize and realize this is the Messiah. So they start saying this messianic psalm. But it goes a little bit further. The people begin shouting Hosanna to the Son of David, which is a messianic title. So again, the Jews knew that the feast were rehearsals, and they were expecting the Messiah to come to fulfill the feast. So this wasn't just a triumphant entry. This was Jesus entering as the Messiah and as the final Passover lamb. And for 4 days, he was on the Temple Mount being examined by the people, the priests, and the religious leaders. Just as the Passover lambs were being examined every day for 4 days. So what you would do is, you got your Passover lamb, on the 10th you inspected it. You inspected it on the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th. On the 14th day, you're going to slay it. Jesus arrives on the 10th. He's examined by the religious leaders, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th. What day is he going to be crucified? He's going to be crucified on the same day that the Passover lambs are going to be slain. So that's what takes place. And at the end of Jesus' trial, this is what's interesting. How many of you remember when they arrested him and brought him before Pilate? At the end of his trial, before he was led away to be crucified, what did Pilate say? Pilate said, I find no fault in him. Those are the very words that the Jews were supposed to say after examining their lamb for 4 days and right before they sacrificed it. Every person who had their Passover lamb, when they brought it up, they had been expecting it for 4 days. This is now the day to sacrifice it. They would bring it before the priest and they would say, I find no fault in it. And that's when they would slay it. Well, that's exactly what Pilate said about Jesus. Not once, but twice. I find no fault in him. Now, the last lamb to be sacrificed every year for Passover was always the high priest's lamb. That's why it was called the final Passover lamb. And it was sacrificed at the 9th hour, which is 3 p.m. And the reason that it had to be done by 3 p.m. was because he had another ritual to perform before the sun went down. So at the 9th hour, the high priest sacrificed his lamb, and as soon as he sacrificed his lamb and he caught the blood in the bow, after he caught all the blood, he would take a step back, he would spread his arms, and he would shout, "It is finished!" And at the very time that the high priest spreads his arms and shouts that, Jesus is on the cross. He takes one more gasp of air, and he shouts out, "It is finished!" And he died. Now listen to me. Jesus still had to descend into hell to pay for our sins. So why in the world did he scream, "It is finished"? Well, I'll tell you why. Because as God's high priest, he was letting us know that the final Passover lamb had been slain. And we would never, ever have to sacrifice a Passover lamb again. He was the final Passover lamb. And as the Passover lambs were going into the ovens, Jesus' body was going into the grave. And as the lambs were being cooked by fire, Jesus' soul was in hell. Now the high priest still had a ritual to perform before the sun went down on that day, the day of Passover. He had to mark the first fruits that were going to be offered to God in the temple on the first day of the week, Sunday. That's when you celebrated the Feast of First Fruits, the Bikurim. So after the final Passover lamb had been slain, the high priest and his entourage would cross the Kidron Valley. How many of you have ever been to Israel? I've been to Israel several times. When you stand on the Mount of Olives, you can look across the Kidron Valley and you see the Temple Mount. If you're on the Temple Mount, you can look out over the Kidron Valley and you see the Mount of Olives. So after the final Passover lamb had been slain, the high priest and his entourage, they would cross the Kidron Valley and they would walk up the Mount of Olives to the small barley field that the Levites had planted just for this event. And then what they would do is they would go into this barley field and they would reach out, the high priest would, and he would grab as much of the stalks of the barley that he could, and he would bring them together. And then he would hold it with one arm and try to bring a little bit more in. And then he would reach out with the other arm and try to bring a little bit more in until he finally had it all. And then he had an assistant that was with him, and he would come in and he would grab it for him. Then the high priest would take the cord and he would wrap it around and he would tie it. All right? But he didn't cut them. He did 10 sheaves like that, but they were still attached to the ground. They were not cut. Those 10 sheaves were being marked as the first fruits. They were the sheaves that were going to be offered to God in the temple on the day of the Feast of First Fruits. All right? Now, the scripture tells us that about the time they were tying those sheaves, there was an earthquake. And it caused the tombstones on certain tombs to roll open. People, that's what Matthew was talking about. And I'm sure they must have stopped for a second as they felt the tremors of the earthquake. But when the earthquake stopped, they finished what they were doing. So after the first fruits were marked, the high priest and his entourage, they went back to the Temple Mount and they ate their Passover meal. As I said, you fixed the Passover and you got everything ready, but you actually didn't eat it till the sun went down. And when the sun went down, it started a new day, which was the day of what? The day of unleavened bread. Why did you wait until then? Because the Passover lamb takes away the sin of the world. So you have to eat it with unleavened bread, symbolizing that this Passover lamb is taking away our sin. Everyone understand? All right. And then, as they were participating and they were partaking of the Passover lamb, then Friday passed. And then Saturday passed. And about an hour before the sun was to rise on the first day of the week, it was finally time to harvest the bikurim. That's the Hebrew word for the first fruits. Because the first day of the week during the Feast of Unleavened Bread is when the Feast of First Fruits was celebrated. So the high priest and his entourage, he always had people with him. His people, what do you call them, peeps? So the high priest and his peeps, they would go back to the same barley field on the Mount of Olives, and it was normally about 5 to 5:30 in the morning. You see, the first hour, what they called the first hour, was 6 o'clock, because that's usually when the sun came up in Israel. Then you had the third hour, 9 o'clock, right? Then you had the sixth hour, which was noon, and then you had the ninth hour, which was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, they had to reap this before the sun came up. They had no idea why they were doing this. But you need to remember that right before the sun came up, when was Jesus resurrected? Yeah, so let's keep going. So about 5 or 5:30 in the morning, before the sun came up, the high priest and his entourage would climb back up on the Mount of Olives, and then they would walk up to each one of the sheaves that had been marked, and the high priest would take a sickle, and he would cut the bottom of the stalks, freeing them from the roots that tied them to the earth. In fact, that's how they described it. That's very significant. These stalks that were tied to the earth, he literally would cut them, freeing them from being tied to the earth. And then he would place each one of the sheaves into a basket to take back to the temple to present to God. And at the same time, the high priest was harvesting the first fruits. At the very same time that he was cutting those stalks, Jesus was resurrected. But not just Jesus. Turn to Matthew chapter 27, verses 50 through 53, and let's read that again. Because everything is happening just like it did during these feasts. So let's read that. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. When did he do that? 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the ninth hour, when the high priest had just got through slaying his and said, "It is finished." That's when Jesus said, "It is finished," and he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rock split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many of the saints who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Now notice what this is saying. When Jesus died and the earthquake happened, some of the tombs broke open. In other words, the tombstones covering the graves rolled away. They revealed these tombs were open. But the people in those tombs didn't come to life until after Jesus was resurrected. Look at verse 53 again. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. So they didn't come back to life until after Jesus was resurrected. But their tombs were open 3 days earlier. Why? Why were the tombs open 3 days earlier? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because the first fruits were always marked on the day of Passover after the final lamb was slain. But they weren't harvested until the Feast of First Fruits 3 days later. So the whole purpose of the earthquake when Jesus died was to mark which of the saints would be resurrected at the first fruits. Yeah. Now, after the first fruits was harvested, the high priest would take them back to the temple to prepare them for an offering for the Lord. So there was a period of time between the harvesting of the first fruits and the offering to the Lord. Yeah, about an hour and a half. And that's why when Mary saw Jesus in the garden, he told her not to touch him because he hadn't yet ascended to the Father. In fact, he would not ascend until it was the designated time for the priest to offer the first fruits to the Lord in the holy place. You see, at the very time the high priest had everything ready and began offering the first fruits to the Lord was the very time that Jesus was in the temple in heaven offering his first fruits to the Lord. Yeah. But there was a period of time between the time you cut the stalks and to when you actually offered them. So there was this small window of time, about an hour and a half from when Jesus was resurrected to when he ascended to heaven with the first fruits of his harvest to offer them to God. That's why many of the saints who were resurrected had time to go into Jerusalem to appear unto their family and friends. But shortly after that, about an hour and a half later, they ascended with Jesus to the throne of God, where Jesus presented them to God as the first fruits offering. He also took all of the souls that were in the bosom of Abraham to heaven, and they were part of the first fruits offering. So now when a believer dies, his soul goes to heaven, but his body is buried, and it begins to decay. But at the final harvest, because that was just first fruits, at the final harvest, the bodies of all the saints will be resurrected, and they will be reunited once more with their soul. And when is that going to happen? At the rapture, the Feast of Trumpets. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to draw on this whiteboard and just kind of show you exactly what happens and what took place then and what's going to happen in the future. This is a timeline. We'll put this timeline out here, and we'll put this out here, and this is the millennium. That look like the millennium to you? That looks like the millennium to me. So we'll put the cross here. This represents Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Now you need to understand that before Jesus' death, burial, and resurrections, our sins weren't paid for. So all of the saints who lived before Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection could not go to heaven when they died. Why? Because their sins had not yet been paid for. So where did they go when they died? Well, if you had a person that died, and let's make two people here. This is two people. That look like two people to you? All right. So when two people died, one of these people represents those who believed in the Messiah. They believed that God would bring forth the Messiah, which we know to be Jesus. The other one wasn't a believer. So when that person died, this person who was a believer, his soul would be laid into the ground. That's him in his little grave there. And his soul would actually go to a place called the bosom of Abraham. Now, why was it called the bosom of Abraham? Do you remember? Anyone? Because Abraham was always there to welcome whoever believed in the Messiah. So when you came to the bosom of Abraham, when you died, Abraham was there, and he would give you a big old hug, and he would bring you into his bosom. So the Jews always referred to it as the bosom of Abraham. The person who wasn't a believer, when he died, his body went into the grave, but his soul did not go to the bosom of Abraham. He went to the place of torment. All right? Now, we need to understand something because this can cause a little bit of confusion for people who don't know. All of this is referred to as Hades. All right? But Hades is divided into two places. The bosom of Abraham, which was also referred to by the Jews as, guess what? Paradise. That's why he told the thief next to him, this day you will be with me in paradise. But it doesn't mean that Jesus went to the bosom of Abraham. It's just that he has the nature of God, which means that he's omnipresent. It means he's everywhere. So what he's telling you, if you believe in me, you're going to be in paradise. The reason you're going to be there is because I'm there. But when the thief died with him, he couldn't go to heaven yet because the sins hadn't been completely paid for. So the thief went to the bosom of Abraham. This is all the people who believes. All the people who didn't believe, they went to a place of torment. Jesus tells us a little bit about it in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And so you had this great big chasm in between the two. So if you wanted to cross over there to help someone, you couldn't do it. And if they wanted to cross over to get to the place of paradise, they couldn't do it. That's what Jesus taught us. But here's what's neat. On the 10th of Nisan, right here, Jesus enters in. We call it the triumphal entry, but actually he's coming in as the Passover lamb because that's when you selected it. And that's when the high priest would bring in the final Passover lamb. And all these people are coming, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest, which is a messianic psalm. And they're calling out to the Son of David, which is a messianic title. So Jesus comes in on the 10th of Nisan. And for 4 days, he's in the temple. And what's happening in the temple? They're asking him questions. In a sense, what they're doing is they're examining him. And they can find no fault. In fact, when it comes time to kill him, they have to make something up because he's perfect. There's no fault in him. And so what happens is after 4 days, they take him to Pilate. And when he stands before Pilate, Pilate says, I find no fault in him. And he wants to turn him loose. But they won't do it. So he says, you have this custom. You can have this person Barabbas, who is a murderer, and he thinks surely they'll let Jesus go, but they don't. They want Jesus to be crucified. And so when Pilate finally says, okay, he says the same thing again. I find no fault in him. And so he's led to be crucified. The Passover lamb started on the 14th of Nisan, begin at 6 a.m. That's when he's crucified. That's when they first start. But he doesn't actually die until 3 o'clock when the last final Passover lamb is there. So what happens is when he dies, Jesus goes to the place of torment, begins to pay for our sins, right? Yeah. And for 3 days and 3 nights, he's in the place of torment. But the scripture also tells us in the book of 1 Peter that he had to preach to those in captivity. So Jesus does something that no one's ever done before. He's able to cross this chasm. So he doesn't just preach a sermon to those in the bosom of Abraham. He gives them an object lesson. They literally see him come alive across this chasm. His life is brought back into him. He crosses the chasm. He comes over here and he preaches to those in the bosom of Abraham. Why does he have to preach to them? Because they're looking for the Messiah, but they didn't know that Jesus was the Messiah. And they have to accept him as the Messiah. And so guess what takes place? 3 days and 3 nights later, all of a sudden, the high priest on the Sunday is going to the barley field. He's now going to cut the sheaves that have been marked for the first fruits. As soon as that first sickle hits them, shortly before the sun comes up, and he frees them from the earth, Jesus comes alive in the tomb. Boom. He's freed from this. Then all of these people in the bosom of Abraham, they're freed with him after his resurrection. Yeah. That's Sunday. And then he tells Mary, don't touch me yet, I'm not yet ascended. There's this period of time, about an hour and a half, where they've cut these sheaves. Now they take them back to the temple. They're preparing everything. Now when it's time to present these to God as first fruits, that's when Jesus ascends to heaven, takes through everyone in the bosom of Abraham, and he presents the first fruits to God. Now, what is first fruits? First fruits is what you give to God, but you're saying there's going to be a final harvest, a bigger harvest. So now, for those of us who live after the death, burial, and resurrection, when we die, let's have 2 people here. These 2 people represent people who believe in Jesus. This one does, and this is the one who doesn't believe in Jesus. Guess what happens? When this person dies who believes in Jesus, his body goes into the ground, he's buried, but his soul gets to go to heaven. Why doesn't it go to the bosom of Abraham? Because his sins have been paid for. His sins have been paid for. Yeah. The person who dies that doesn't know Jesus, his body goes into the ground, he's buried, but his soul still goes to the place of torment. Now, both of them, their bodies are going to be resurrected, but at 2 different times. When the Feast of Trumpets occurs, everyone who believes in Jesus, their body's going to come out of the grave. It's going to be reunited with their soul. And when I talk about the other feasts, we're going to see how Jesus fulfills those down to the most minute detail. But here's what I want you to understand. Because we were looking at Mary Magdalene, and we saw all these weird things happening. I want you to understand, we believe in Jesus. But the reason we believe in Jesus is because he fulfilled everything that the Bible said he would. He not only fulfilled all of the messianic prophecies, but he also fulfilled everything in the feast. Everything that the Jews were rehearsing, they were rehearsing for when the Messiah came, and he fulfilled those feasts. And just as Jesus fulfilled the spring feast, Jesus is going to fulfill the fall feast. Let me tell you something. Jesus is going to fulfill the fall feast in every last minute detail, just like he did the spring feast.
There's a chair that's never moved, a cup that still remembers remembers you. Sunlight spills across the floor, just like it did before. I kept your books upon the shelf, didn't change a thing myself. Every creak inside this home whispers softly, you're not alone. There's dust on dreams, but they still shine. I've been waiting. Take your time. The porch lights burning through the rain. I'll be here when you come home again. When you come home again, the world can rest its fight. Lay down your heavy heart. You've carried far too tight. No need for words to explain. I'll hold you when you come home again. The map of years is on your face. Every scar's a line of grace. You walked the miles I dreamed you would. Now come back home, it's understood. I'll cook the stew you used to crave. We'll laugh at all the time we saved. The kettle hums a sweet refrain of a love that never washed away. You don't owe me stories told. The road has made your spirit bold. Just sit in my love and breathe again. You're safe inside these hands. When you come home again, the night feels like a song. No matter where you've been, this heart's where you belong. The years may fade, the skies may rain, but I'll still wait when you come home again. So come on home, my child. The door's still open wide. You speak in shadows.